I'm Cheryl Chumley. This is Bold and Blunt, giving you a Christian conservative view of news, politics, culture, and events. Gol Kalev, thank you so much for being back on Bold and Blunt from Israel. It's great to have you again.
My pleasure.
So you're in Jerusalem today as well?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I wanted to start first by, I wonder if you have heard Israel's intelligence, what they're saying about these UNRWA, the Relief and Works Agency for the Palestinian refugees or Palestinian people, how there were certain workers there who helped Hamas commit these terror attacks against Israel on October 7th. Do you have any latest info on that?
Yeah, I mean, nobody here is surprised. UNRWA has been linked with Hamas for years, but even going back, UNRWA, the UN agency, was born in sin. It is, in a sense, it is a form of Western colonialism, because UNRWA was created after the 1948 war, where in those years there were a lot of refugees, dozens, maybe 100 million refugees around the world, in Germany, in Europe, in Pakistan, in India. There were 800,000 Jewish refugees that were ethnically cleansed from the Middle East. And there was also about 700 or 800,000 Palestinian refugees. And this agency was created for the purpose of keeping them as refugees, of perpetuating the conflict. And then over the next 70, 80 years, they've just indoctrinated the Palestinians that they have under their control with outright anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-peace, pro-war, pro-terrorism messages, which they have in their textbooks in their schools. And so there's no wonder there's a lot of touch points with Hamas, and that nobody here is surprised that many, or that some of the people in UNRWA participated in the atrocious attacks, and many more supported it.
So Donald Trump actually stopped funding to this agency early on in his presidency, and Joe Biden almost immediately put the funding back. At one point, I think the latest figures were that America was donating almost or more than $1 billion to this agency. The funding has been stopped right now, but I wanted to talk to you about the part of this conflict in the Middle East that always goes underreported or not reported, the fact that it's a religious war at root, because nobody wants to talk about that. And you have the pro-Palestinian apologists, the liberals, and so forth, talking about how the conflict is about land and about oppression and civil rights and economic opportunity. But when you look at what just happened with these UNRWA workers helping Hamas, to me, that just furthers the idea that it's at root a religious war. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, as you said, UNRWA, Donald Trump was correct to stop American funding, because what the reality has been that American taxpayers like you and me and all Americans are passively supporting terrorism and supporting messages that enhance terrorism and delay peace by supporting UNRWA. So Trump was correct to cut it. Biden was wrong to reinstate it, and Biden is certainly correct to cut the funding now. Look, I mean, it's there. Of course, people from the West come here, whether they're journalists or whether they're members of the so-called conflict industry, people that work in UNRWA, that work in the UN, that work in the EU, and some of them are my friends. They come with this idealistic view that this is some, like simplistic frameworks of cowboys and Indians and people under oppression, and they quickly realize that they're part of the problem, that the conflict industry, themselves, like UNRWA employees, are part of the problem. So this conflict has been very simplified. Of course, there's a religious element to it, but it's also important to note that Muslims around the world, I have a lot of Muslim friends around the world who are very supportive of Israel, and not just around the world, here in Israel. Last week, we've lost a lot of soldiers in one particular incident. One of them was a Muslim. In October 7th, some of the people that died were Muslims. And certainly, as I mentioned, some of the people who are fighting for Israel are Muslims, as well as Druze. So there is an element of that. Certainly, Hamas has a religious theology associated with the Muslim Brotherhood that it abides by. But it is also important to note that in Israel, unlike in Europe, where you have a system of mutual negation, where you have essentially the making of what could be the war of European succession. You have the legacy Europeans, atheists or former Christians that are completely rejecting the Muslims and trying to take off their hijab, take off their particularity, trying to de-Islamicize them. And the Muslims who come to Europe and have their own lives in their own enclaves and completely reject the legacy Europeans. So we have a system of mutual rejection, and everybody's trying to make the others like themselves. In Israel, we respect the Muslim minority here. Some of them are elites in certain aspects of Israeli society. If you go to a hospital, it's pretty likely that either your doctor or your surgeon or your nurse will be Muslim. So we, I call it symbiotic particularity. We celebrate the particularity of Muslims who contribute to societies. Certainly the Druze do, who are elite in the police, in the military. And this is a much better template. So we're certainly heartened by the support that we're getting from everybody, but in particular from Muslims in Israel and outside of Israel.
It's fascinating when you look at Jerusalem and the four quarters, and so closely coexisting. You have the Jewish quarter, the Armenian quarter, the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter. So I wanted you to speak to that in general, just how all these different faiths coexist so peacefully, so well. But at the same time, are there concerns that just as Hamas terrorists infiltrated UNRWA, right, and helped commit this atrocity against Israel, are there concerns that the same thing can happen in the Muslim quarter in Jerusalem?
I would say less so in the Muslim quarter in Jerusalem. The attacks that happened in the old city of Jerusalem over the years have not been carried by the Muslims in Jerusalem. They're usually people from the outside, from Hebron and other places who are coming and committing the terrorist acts there. But so there is certainly concern that Palestinians in the West Bank, it's not a concern, it's happening as it is. There is militias that are active, and there's an active front in certain cities in the West Bank between terrorists and the IDF. We have terrorist attacks that occurred over the last weeks in the West Bank. So just like we have a front in Gaza and a front in Lebanon, we have the risk of a brewing front in the West Bank with the Palestinian population, and everybody is also monitoring and watching, the Israeli Arab population. But the Israeli Arab population, there are, in the last go around, there were elements in the Arab population that rioted and participated in the violence. But certainly the assumption is that the vast majority of Muslims in the Arabs in Israel are not going to lend their hands to that. And I would say another thing is that as people in the West Bank and in Lebanon and elsewhere seeing what we're doing in Gaza and how we're decimating Hamas, that serves as deterrent from there to engage with us and open another front.
You wrote this fascinating piece, and I know it was a few years ago, but it seems applicable today, especially since I wanted to talk a little bit more about faith and so forth. And I just want to read from the last paragraph that you wrote on this piece. It appeared in Newsweek in 2020. You wrote, every century has its global philosophical divide. In the 19th century, it was monarchy versus republic. In the 20th century, it was communist versus capitalism. It is possible that this era's philosophical divide is Europeanism versus Americanism. And you point specifically on that point toward faith. Can you speak a little bit to that? Just wrap up speaking about that. Absolutely.
I mean, for centuries, Europe was under stability under the system of what they call divine right monarchy. The belief is that God appoints the kings, and therefore there is stability. The United States rebelled against that, not by rebelling against the divine, but against the monarchy. We in the United States created a divine right republic, one nation under God with the people. Europe, on the other hand, went on the complete opposite direction and created the opposite system. They rebelled against the divine. Just like America today is a product of the American Revolution, much of Europe is directly or indirectly a byproduct of the French Revolution, which amongst other things was a rebellion against God, not just against the church. They even tried to change the work week from 7 days to 10 days to negate the notion that God created the world. So this is the philosophical aspect, but it plays out even in Jerusalem. You have faith, American faith versus, European secularism and not just atheism, antitheism. You have particularity versus universalism. You have ideology in the United States. versus the idea of post-ideology, post-narrative. And it's not black and white. You have European elements in the United States, and American sympathizers, if you will, in Europe. I mean, it's a much more layered and nuanced than that. But it plays out very nicely in Jerusalem, because even in a very basic level, you see the United States moving its embassy to Jerusalem for years, for decades. Congress passes, years after years, overwhelming resolutions to move the embassy to Jerusalem. President Trump moves it. President Biden keeps it. So the America's narrative is intertwined with Jerusalem, the shiny city on the hill, America as the new Zion. Europe, on the other hand, negates Jerusalem. And, you talked at the beginning about UNRWA. There's another UN agency, UNESCO, that a few years ago passed a resolution with the support or abstention of European countries that implies that Jerusalem has no connection to Judaism and Christianity. They passed it, it was a ludicrous resolution, so much that the Mexican representative to UNESCO resigned because it was too ludicrous, historically ridiculous. The French prime minister, by the way, apologized for their vote, but then when the resolution came again, France voted the same way. So again, European countries either abstained or supported this ludicrousy of this almost like neo-religion opposition to Jerusalem. So as I said, the world, all this conflict is between Jerusalem and Europe, between Israel and Europe, if you will, that goes back to 2,300 years to the Greek invasion here. And as a relating to that, and one of the offshoots of that is what we're seeing, I think, is the evolving philosophical divide of our era over the next few decades between the Europeanism philosophy of negating religion, of negating particularity, of universalism, and Americanism, which is anchored in faith, which is anchored in particularity, in nationalism. And, you see Israel squarely on the side of the American. It's basically an expression that Zionism and Americanism are sister ideologies. And you see the Abraham Accords, which are a byproduct of the Americanism way of thinking, that, yes, UAE, Morocco, keep your particularity. We're not going to try to secularize you and Americanize you or Europeanize you. Keep who you are, accept Israel for who they are, and we're going to have peace for peace. So, you're seeing this play out right now in Jerusalem and in Israel, but I think you're going to continue seeing this play over the next decades. And that was the Newsweek article that you mentioned. I also mentioned in my book, Judaism 3.0, that the arching sort of like overriding philosophical divide is shaping up to be between Americanism and Europeanism.
And I was about to ask you, and you already answered it, how that was playing out with the Jewish people, if they were taking sides in that culture battle. So you sort of addressed that. Maybe we can get into more of that deeper next week. I'd love to have you back.
I would just mention quickly that there is a divide here also between, the Jewish people in Israel are playing it in one way, and some of my Jewish friends in America are more subscribing to the Europeanized kind of version of universalism and anti-religion.
And they would be the Democrat voters, I'm sure, here in America. So,
but it's not just a Republican versus Democrat. There's, right. I think the line is someplace within the Democratic Party.
Well, we can get into more of that next week if you like, because that sounds fascinating to talk about as well. It's always great to have you. You are so interesting. Gol Kalev, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I'll talk with you soon.
My pleasure. Good to see you.